The days were growing warmer, but the nights remained cool. To prevent the build-up of condensation in the barrel, the breech cover was to be removed and the breech block left open during the night. The morning sun warmed our bare heads as we savoured the unusual luxury of marching fully upright in the open and under a clear sky, without the weight of steel helmets, entrenching tools, and gas masks. We finally reached Saragol, the location of the former supply headquarters, where we could again enjoy the luxuries of sleeping and bathing. We took time to visit the Soldiers' Club in Feodosia, which had been equipped with a movie theatre. The survival at the front, living in filth, crawling through wet, muddy trenches, or crouching in dark, cold clay bunkers, seemed to be behind us forever, as we were provided the temporary illusion of peace in the spring sunshine of Crimea. After several days, we were finally able to relax fully without the nerve-wracking anticipation of an enemy night attack hammering at our subconsciousness. The two truck drivers, who had remained in the rear with the supply unit, had already prepared warm water and fresh clothing for our arrival. Mamushka, Marussia, and Pan welcomed us with nods and grins. Pan even removed his lamb's wool cap in greeting, and we saw his stringy grey hair for the first time. I reported the location of the crew to the company administrative unit. Hauptfeldwebel Kramer was at the company headquarters, and our company clerk, Clamp, explained to me that, other than the normal cleaning and weapons maintenance, there was nothing notable for us in the schedule, which pleased us immensely. The following morning, we were abruptly awakened by the clamorous sound of excited voices nearby. Heinz had just arrived from drawing coffee rations, and he dashed in to inform me that our 3 Crimean hosts, who had been providing us with quarters, had obviously had something stolen from them during the night. I quickly pulled on my uniform and stepped through the timber-framed doorway into the morning sun. And on the back side of the wall was a small wooden storage building with the door hanging loosely open. Standing and weeping at the door were Mamushka and Marussia, while Pan was pacing rapidly back and forth between the shed and the road, his dirty lamb's wool cap pulled low over his head. As I approached the scene, the 2 women beckoned to me excitedly and pointed into the shed. Peering inside, I observed only an empty stall. The dirt floor was littered with straw and manure from its recently departed occupant. "Kurova Zapsarap, the cow is stolen," I heard them exclaiming. I was immediately overcome with sympathy for the pitiful figures before me, who obviously had only one animal that had been carefully cared for and successfully nurtured through the winter. Between words and gesticulations, I was made aware that it soon would have had calves and given milk. The trio had successfully kept the animal hidden from us, perhaps fearing that the strange invaders would requisition their single most valuable possession. 8 weeks previously, when we had first made our quarters here at their expense, I had known nothing of the existence of the cow, but I vaguely recalled seeing Pan slipping into the hut occasionally with a water pail or a bundle of straw under his arm. I attempted to calm them as much as possible under the circumstances of their terrible loss. "Kurova Nasat, the cow will return," I said, attempting to console them. Incensed that someone would have entered into our chosen quarters and stolen from our benefactors, we began the search before midday. The 13th Company had their support unit in the area, and inquiries brought no results from their company spies. We passed through various rear echelon units and a Coast Guard unit manning a heavy coastal gun, but we had no success. We vainly searched behind walls, in damaged warehouses, and in various dwellings scattered throughout the area. The cow remained lost. Romanian units were encamped in the western sector of Saragol Feodosia. We recognized the familiar wall of earthworks and tank traps that wound around the city in a half-circle. As we walked along the perimeter, we discerned the soft lowing of a cow in the distance. Continuing along the wall, we suddenly came upon a number of cattle and sheep grazing on the thin, dry grass from last year and eagerly seeking the first green twigs of spring. Using the dwellings for concealment, we approached closer and soon left the last house to skirt the grazing animals in a wide arc until we could reach the earthworks. The earthen defences provided us with additional concealment, which we fully used to approach within 100 metres of the animals. Leaving the protection of the earthworks, we crawled around the edge of the wall and approached to within 50 metres of a small herd of approximately 10 cattle and 50 sheep, grazing contentedly under the guard of 2 listless Romanian soldiers crouching over a small fire with their backs to us. We quickly formulated an attack plan. Heinz and Wolf hastily scrambled on all fours toward the nearest cow. It initially continued grazing, seeming oblivious of our presence, then began showing signs of nervousness as the 2 intruders approached. Carefully, the 2 creeping figures isolated the cow and slowly herded it toward our prearranged location, being careful not to frighten the suspicious animal. The cow shied away from the oncoming lancers, always keeping a safe distance between herself and the 2 strangers. Along the edge of the earthwork stood several puddles, which served to entice the thirsty creature nearer. As she approached our position and lowered her head to one of the puddles, 4 pairs of fists tightly gripped her horns. She struggled half-heartedly to free herself. A length of Russian communications cable was quickly looped about her neck, and with 2 men pulling from the front and 2 pushing from the rear, we frantically dragged and pulled the reluctant creature rapidly along the earthwork to a depression. Here we chanced a quick glimpse over the wall. The Romanians had noticed nothing. We led the cow closer to the safety of our bivouac area before expressing our satisfaction in our prize. We stroked the brown curly hair and remarked to one another on the qualities of such a fine animal, although one of our members from a farming family observed that she was somewhat small and thin. In the dusk of the evening, Wolf and Heinz led the cow back to our quarters. Mamushka, Marussia, and Pan had given up their desperate search, and were sitting dejectedly in the house as the 2 men led the cow unnoticed into the shed and secured the door. I stepped through the door to surprise them. "Kurova nasat!" The cow is back. They leaped to their feet as I beckoned to the unhappy trio to follow, and they halted in astonishment in the half-darkness of the shed. The animal raised its muzzle and sniffed its new owners cautiously. Pan then excitedly explained to me that their previous cow was a malenki kurove, a small cow, and that this one was bolshoi, large, with much nichevo, it doesn't matter, and charastjo, it's all right. I attempted to explain to him that he could keep this one. Tears formed in the old man's dark eyes, and the women sniffed. Pan knelt before me and attempted to hug my knees, and only with effort was I able to successfully defend myself from this unexpected, undesired, and embarrassing display of gratitude. That evening, together with our hosts, we celebrated Kurova Nasat with sweetened hot tea and immense satisfaction for an accomplishment well done. During the previous months, we had on occasion requisitioned from them chickens, geese, and eggs, and we were more than satisfied at having had an opportunity to repay their generosity. The Crimean spring began early. In mid-April, we again moved to our regular quarters in Feodosia Sarigol, which were still available to us only because our driver successfully defended the place from other units during our absence when we were in action on the icebreaker, the factory, and on Hill 66.3. The 14th Company of Regiment 437 was now led by Lieutenant Zoll, a professional officer who always had an eye and ear for all the small details and problems of the Lancers. Every member of the company was permitted to come to him directly to address problems when necessary. I once witnessed how David and Conrad, the 2 pony cart drivers of the company, cursed our leaders in Berlin, and particularly our Führer in Braun, in their strong Swabian-Bavarian dialect, when they were once again forced to evacuate their warm quarters in Sarigol for a troop movement. Of course, the Swabish greeting heard from the 2 was not forgotten, and an officer of strong National Socialist beliefs would have considered the outburst grounds for a report of defeatist attitude, or even contributing to demoralization. Such offences were punishable by assignment to a penal unit or worse. Their reasoning was that where such slander is permitted, it only breeds contempt and spreads defeatism throughout the ranks. Our company commander, a thoroughly professional officer who intimately understood life on the front from the perspective of the Lancers, realized that as long as the men possessed the wherewithal to curse their situation, life remained normal in the trenches. Regardless of their criminal behavior of being somewhat outspoken and of having volatile tempers, the two otherwise continued to prove themselves reliable and brave. Conrad had received the Iron Cross for his action while serving with my gun crew during the tank battle of Mekonsivy Gori. In February, he had always managed with his pony cart to supply us with food and munitions, regardless of how harsh and extreme conditions had been in the Podpach line. One night he arrived at our position earlier than usual. When asked about his early arrival, he indicated that he had taken a left turn after passing a marsh. He denied having taken a shortcut through a Russian minefield, which was clearly identified and cordoned off to traffic with white tape markers. However, this was the only possible route that he could have travelled such a distance in the limited period of time. The only reason we could attribute to his successful traversing of the minefield was the probability that the earth was frozen over the surface of the mines, or that the ice was not thawed between the pressure plates and detonators. Throughout the campaign on the Eastern Front, he seemed to have been watched by his own personal guardian angel, and was one of the few in the company to survive the war. Again, the night brought freezing temperatures and total darkness. Although Conrad insisted on releasing his ponies to take him back to the headquarters after nightfall, I ordered him to remain with us until dawn. He obeyed without complaint and received a warm schnapps in reward for his compliance. After caring for the ponies and covering them with old woolen blankets, he secured the cart with a stick thrust through the spokes before returning to the warmth of the bunker stove. In spite of the nightly rifle and machine gun fire, with occasional tracers bouncing and curving through the darkness, the ponies remained quiet. After having been faithful servants to the German Wehrmacht for so many months, they had become accustomed to the nightly sounds of the front. They stirred only slightly in the darkness and munched contentedly on the roofing straw Conrad had brought to them. Even they felt the effects of our overextended supply lines, as the coarse straw was the only provision we could make available to them. Conrad returned to the horses with the coming of first light, only to find their front hooves frozen fast in the deep mud. It was necessary to hack them free with a pick, and the sun was rising behind the Russian positions as he departed with hub and hot commands to the pair of horses. His departure was marked by the distant rattling of a Maxim MG on the line, and several of the machine gun rounds impacted nearby. With the coming of daylight, he made a tempting and not too distant target for the ever-watchful gentleman opposite the line from us. The next evening, Conrad's cart again arrived at our position, bringing us much-needed supplies. Shortly after his arrival, he became visibly irritated at our complaints that the comice bread smelled and tasted strongly of fuel oil. As a further wound to his pride, I accused him of having loaded the bread sack next to the diesel oil canister from which we drained fuel for our bunker lanterns and stove. The following day, he returned without the fuel canister, and we spent the night in darkness, using our last ration of oil to heat food and retain a semblance of warmth within the bunker. Despite the insults we had heaped on Conrad the previous day, the bread continued to taste as though it had been dipped in oil. Only weeks later did we learn that the bakery company personnel had discovered a number of grain silos in the Kerch harbour, but prior to their withdrawal, the Russians had poured fuel over the grain and ignited it. Fortunately, only the top layer had burned, leaving the remainder singed and foul-smelling. However, in the professional opinion of the German army, this was a windfall that was considered to be fully fit for consumption. To augment the critical supply situation, the grain was used for baking bread, which reeked of fuel oil and tasted like gasoline. Little did we realize that before our odyssey in the Soviet Union was over, we would long for a taste of a morsel only half so good. After we moved into the Sarigol quarters, there remained one duty to our comrades yet to be fulfilled. We gathered clusters of the first spring flowers from the surrounding hillsides and searched out the division cemetery in Feodosia. The fighting in the Podpach, the attack on Kerch, and the capture of Feodosia had been costly to the division. Those who were killed in action or who had died of wounds in the field hospitals were buried in a park-like garden near a mansion that dated from the Tsar. The large, imposing house was built in an Ottoman style and was located on a height overlooking the bay, surrounded by pines and towering cypress trees. Our division's cemetery had been established here shortly following the capture of Feodosia on the 18th of January. Many of the graves remained marked with simple wooden crosses bearing only the inscription "Unknown German Soldier." There had been several hundred of our comrades lying wounded in the field hospitals in Feodosia when the Russians landed early in January. During the landing that had forced Graf Sponek to conduct his fatal withdrawal, the wounded had been left behind in the care of the medical officers. After their capture by the Soviet forces, many of the wounded had been immediately shot by the Russians where they lay. Others, including a number of those who were unable to walk, had been stripped of their clothing and dragged to the edge of the sea, where they had been doused with water and left to die in the freezing temperatures. These atrocities had been witnessed by some of the few survivors, and their testimony was underscored by accounts given by many men of the division who discovered the victims after the recapture of the city. The graves of these unidentified soldiers were located along the edge of the cemetery. In the centre were buried those men from our division who had lost their lives in the preceding 4 months of action. A massive memorial stood at the head of the cemetery, and along the base, hewn into white sandstone, were the words, "For Greater Germany they fell in the battle for Feodosia, 132 days Infantry Division." Years later, I received a photograph of the memorial from the personal effects of General Lindemann, and on the back the general had written, "Did they have to die?" We searched for and located the graves of our company comrades and marked them with flowers placed carefully on the freshly disturbed soil. To this day they lie deep in Russian earth, the dead from the attack on Feodosia and Kerch, from the Parpach, from the White House, from Hill 66.3, and from the icebreaker. The irony is that for those who fell in battle, noted cemeteries and impressive memorials were built, but for those who died of wounds or sickness in the rear areas, even the boots could not remain on their feet. Through official orders, the boots had to be removed for use by someone else, as leather had become a scarce commodity. As the war continued, it became rare for the dead to be afforded even a shelter quarter in which they could be covered or wrapped. The corpse, mutilated and torn on the field of battle, would be placed into a shallow grave and simply covered with earth. The ashen, waxy countenance, with half-open mouth and dull eyes staring sightlessly at the sky, would seem to ask, "Why must I now die? I have not yet lived, and before my journey you even pull the boots from my feet. My loyalty and my thoughts remain with you, beyond the grave to eternity. So rest in peace, my dear friends, my loyal comrades." After suffering a major defeat in Feodosia, the Russian 34th Army retreated with the remains of its heavily manned division to the strongly fortified Parpach position, and, from the 20th of January, remained entrenched in a well-planned defensive posture. The aim of the enemy was to halt a further German attack on the Parpach position, and behind this protective barrier to rebuild and re-equip the battled units, as well as to position new divisions in preparation for a new offensive. The enemy was prepared to recapture the territory we were occupying at any price. The sunny Crimea, the pearl of Soviet Russia, was considered strategically invaluable. The plan was to cut off the German 11th Army from a strike on Perekop, to surround and destroy it, and thus to bring about the collapse of the entire German southern front through the exposed right flank. The recapture of Crimea was a question of prestige for the Soviets as well. Through the planned offensive, the Red Commanders hoped to end the danger of a permanent occupation of Crimea by the German Wehrmacht, and to prevent a permanent presence in the Caucasus and Black Sea areas. In the words of a Soviet commissar, victory in the Crimea is the key to the overall defeat of the enemy. To carry through the plan of eliminating the German presence in Crimea, a strong concentration of forces was built up on the Kerch Peninsula, supported by the massing of hundreds of armoured vehicles. They were confident of a certain victory. By the end of January, new divisions were brought from the Caucasus near Kursk and Kamis-Burum, many marching over the ice to their assembly areas. On the 25th of January, the German strength stood at a total of 4 combined German and Romanian divisions, with 2 Russian armies composed of 9 divisions and 2 rifle brigades opposing them. By the 26th of February, the Soviet forces had been increased to 12 rifle divisions and 1 cavalry division, with an overall kilo and 2 tank brigades in the States. Opposite the Soviet Army Corps sector, which was held over by a small division, lay the Russian 54th Army infantry divisions. The 130th Unit, which had months of difficult fighting with the rest of the Theodosia Army, faced an overwhelming support army that required a hot, totally related to Russian divisions. And the next day, January 20th, remained calm. You will remember how the attacks as an effective approach of the German defenses, resulting in 4 During this period, the Soviets systematically strengthened their forces. The Great Russian Offensive was predicted for February 23, 1942, a date traditionally celebrated as Red Army Day. As a special gift to the Russian people, the Crimea was to be returned to them. However, the predicted date came and went. Due to the endless rain and low-lying clouds that blanketed the area, the attack had to be postponed. On February 27th, the attack struck the entire front with unimaginable fury. 7 rifle divisions, 2 rifle brigades, and 2 armoured brigades assaulted in multiple waves. The XXX and KWI-TC2 Army Corps positions came under merciless artillery barrages, with the pressure point of the ground attack falling directly on the latter. The goal of the attack was to capture the rail intersection at Vladislavivka, an important point in the perilous supply route for the German forces. Further operations toward Feodosia and Dushankoy were planned to destroy German strength in those strategically important areas. The resulting attacks by 3 Soviet divisions, consisting of 60 tanks, 22 batteries of all calibers, and strong air support, were halted by a single German division, the 132 Days Infantry Division. All attacks were beaten back, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. The Soviets eventually succeeded in breaking through the north wing of the Quetzalcoatl Corps, but were quickly beaten back, and the penetration was sealed. The enemy forces suffered heavy losses in men and material during the attacks. To fulfill the requirements of remaining on the offensive, the units first had to be re-equipped and brought up to strength in personnel. The enemy positions to the east and west of the tank trenches were first strengthened. The failure of these attacks to achieve a major breakthrough and the subsequent decrease in enemy activity indicated to the German commanders that the offensive strength of the enemy infantry was nearing exhaustion. Despite immeasurable losses, the Soviet plan for recapturing the Crimea was not abandoned. The enemy force on the peninsula was reinforced through mid-March with 13 rifle divisions, 1 cavalry division, 3 additional rifle brigades, and 4 armoured brigades. The replenished enemy forces launched a renewed offensive against the positions of the XXX and CKT-C Corps. The Soviet forces, now consisting of 13 rifle divisions, 3 rifle brigades, and 4 armoured brigades, reinforced by strong artillery and air force units, ran headlong against the German positions without success. The battered German line, although unable to be re-equipped or strengthened, continued to hold. The recent English-American influence in the war effort became more apparent. New vehicles of American manufacture could be observed in quantity. Medical supplies captured from the Soviet units bore descriptions and markings in the English language. Despite massive amounts of aid arriving from across the Atlantic, the situation remained unchanged. Prisoners and deserters repeatedly stated that the Russian soldiers had lost faith in a victory, and that the aim of liberating the Crimea had been personally ordered by Stalin to be successful at any cost. Thus, waves of Soviet soldiers continued to assault the German lines, spurred on by a combination of intense patriotism and fear of the political commissars. On April 9th, the enemy launched a renewed offensive against German positions on both sides of Koyasol, with most of the pressure on the KXXX Corps. 8 rifle divisions and 4 armoured brigades, supported by strong artillery and air support, assaulted the German positions until April 12th without success. Prisoners stated that the objective for April 9th had been Feodosia. The 132 Days Infantry Division victoriously defended itself against combined assaults from 4 rifle divisions and 2 armoured brigades, consisting of approximately 100 tanks of various types. Despite heavy artillery fire from approximately 35 batteries of all calibers, combined with intense air attacks, the German infantrymen held their positions. A total of 53 tanks, including the heaviest models, were destroyed, evidenced by the burning steel carcasses that exploded and smoked for days before our positions. After again suffering disastrous losses, prisoners spoke of thousands of dead. The Russians eased their offensive on April 13th. According to statements provided by deserters and captured documents, the Russian divisions had been bled white, forcing a reorganization and disassembly of the forces that had so recently opposed us in full strength. Despite major defeats and innumerable casualties, the Russian command held fast to their original plan. 2 more divisions were transferred to the Kerch Peninsula. The artillery opposing the XXX Corps was strengthened by 38 batteries, which were to become active on May 1st. For unknown reasons, this never occurred. Perhaps they expected a German counterattack, or perhaps the Soviets were awaiting still more reinforcements. All attempts by the enemy, with vast superiority in troops and equipment, to recapture the Crimea and destroy Manstein's 11th Army met with defeat. The German soldier, especially the infantry, had prevailed against overwhelming odds while fighting under the most adverse conditions. The Trappenjagd offensive was launched during the night of May 7-8 near Feodosia. Artillery pieces, tanks, flak units, munitions carriers, and foot-slogging infantry companies wound in endless columns throughout the night, concentrated along the few paved roads around the bay of Feodosia as they marched toward the east. The enemy build-up and preparation areas behind the Parpach position had been taken by a penetration through the Soviet defences and had to be exploited at any cost. Now was the chance to break out of the trench warfare in which the army had found itself mired. The Russians fired their artillery in irregular blocking fire. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet also sent barrages into our marching area from their warships. It was possible to observe the muzzle flashes far toward the southeast as they cast reflections on the dark water, with the horizon flashing erratically like a distant summer storm. The seconds could be counted between the sighting of the muzzle flash and the impact on our assembly areas. Despite the terrifying presence of the massive artillery employed against us, the shell bursts remained inconsistent and inflicted little damage. Flying at high altitude over our heads and along the coastal advance route, a lone Russian aircraft rattled. Having grown accustomed to this routine nuisance, it had been dubbed Iron Gustav, sewing machine of the watch, or fog crow by the Lancers. This particular aircraft would spurt salvos of tracer fire toward the earth, and a few bombs would be dropped, whistling annoyingly as they descended, enough to demoralize the new replacements. The old hares had become very familiar with these primitive night flyers, aircraft pieced together from wood and canvas, with a 5-pointed red star displayed on the fuselage. One of the nightly experiences of the Eastern Front, they seemed to accompany us everywhere. The old Gefreiters no longer bothered to react when they heard the droning of the motor accompanied by the whistle of the bombs, as they were fully aware that if a bomb could be heard, the impact point would be at least 100 meters away. The order for the attack on Kerch was finally received. With this order, which signified a long-sought change in the static warfare, the morale of the troops in the line immediately improved. At 0300 on May 8th, a sudden, heavy Russian artillery barrage descended on us, ending just as quickly at 0310. At 0310, watches were synchronized, and at 0315, the entire front erupted with artillery fire. The fire plan ran according to schedule, down to the most minute detail. Observations could still not be determined because of darkness, and at 0338 came the first response from the Russian artillery, with a barrage on the factory area of Daln-Kamishi. At 0350, a strong barrage of Russian mortar fire fell for a short time on the icebreaker. The Russians were obviously now alert to our attack. With the advance of the barrage, green and red tracer fire could already be seen east of the Turtle. At 0402, German fighters and Stukas were continuously in the sky, diving on the Soviet ground positions in long lines, peeling from formations high above the battlefield, their silhouettes barely visible against the dawn sky. At 0418, the first Russian Ratas appeared, which were immediately pounced on by the German fighter squadrons and destroyed. At 0430, the familiar sight of prisoners could be seen, being escorted to the rear in long columns. At 0444, the report from the first battery arrived. Direct hit upon gun, 2 men wounded, gun is out of action. Again at 0500. The visibility allows for observed firing. Our infantry have overrun the tank trenches, and with units from Infantry Regiment 436 have established a bridgehead by landing with assault craft. At 0535, the Russian fire from their flak batteries had grown noticeably weaker. At 0545, all fire on the Baker bunker and enemy concentrations on Hill 50.6 was silenced. At 0625, the forward observers of the first battery fired on enemy tanks visible in the foreground. At 0630, the observers for the second battery were reported to have established a position on As-Tishchaluka. At 0745, a reconnaissance unit was dispatched to reconnoitre positions for forward observation and fire positions. In the time from 0755 until 1100, the forward observers from the first battery found nests of strong resistance in the Balka-Peshchaya. And from the observation positions of the first battery, enemy columns marching toward the east, as well as strong enemy movements south of Point 323, were taken under fire. At 1100, the third battery shifted positions in the area east of the tank trenches. At 1215, Point 323, the Moscow bunker, was reported captured by our infantry. Simultaneously, to the east of 323, the first battery put an enemy tank out of action. At 1220, the unit headquarters was resituated. At 1345, the first and second batteries followed with a shift in position. Afterward, the forward observers directed blocking fire onto Hill 50.2, and darkness eliminated all further visibility. The Russian soldier proved to be an extremely tough adversary who could endure the most adverse conditions. With the onset of our march into the Soviet Union, we found ourselves facing an unpredictable enemy whose methods, resistance, or loyalties could not be predicted or even estimated. At times, we faced fanatical resistance from a handful of troops who would fight to the last round, and, even when all resources were exhausted, would refuse to surrender. Other situations revealed an enemy who would surrender en masse with the least amount of resistance offered, seemingly without a clearly definable reason. Prisoner interrogations revealed that these variables had little to do with education, region of origin, or political leanings. A simple peasant would resist bitterly, whereas a trained military commander would surrender immediately upon contact. The next encounter would indicate that the opposite had occurred, seemingly without pattern or identifiable cause. Trapped in a former copper mine near Kerch, a number of officers and soldiers of the Red Army continued to resist throughout the entire occupation of the peninsula. When water supplies within their stronghold were exhausted, they resorted to licking the moisture from the damp walls in an effort to prevent death from dehydration. Despite the brutality exhibited by the antagonists on the Russian front, the opposing German forces developed a deep respect for these survivors who refused to surrender throughout weeks, months, and years of stubborn resistance. In the early stages of the war, we were facing a massive, unwieldy force that had been stripped of professional leadership, politically cleansed, and resurrected in communist ideology. The revolution of 1918 had led the political operatives in the Soviet Union to believe that only a steadfast political ideology, such as had prevailed during the revolution, would win wars. Thus, in the pre-war years between 1937 and 1938, Stalin had effectively stripped the Red Army of professional leadership in favor of political appointees, with whom he placed his destiny. These political appointees were successful in dismantling the army that had been created from the early years of the Soviet system. The large armoured units were discarded and reorganised to employ obsolete cavalry tactics. Discipline was maintained according to lines of political reliability rather than military effectiveness. In 1941, these changes, brought about by Stalin's paranoia inherent in the Bolshevik system, were to cost the Soviet army millions of casualties. It was the massive expanses of territory to be covered, the brutal climate of freezing winters and scorching summers, accompanied by endless rain that turned roads into impassable quagmires in spring and fall, and finally the iron determination of the Russian people before the gates of Moscow and Leningrad that halted our advance. These factors provided the Soviet Union a respite, despite the self-destructive policies inflicted on the Red Army by the communist state. Then, this philosophy took a turn. The Soviet Army reintroduced the ideology of an officer corps, replete with gold-laced shoulder epaulets and jackboots. The traditional officer ranks and titles were resurrected to instill discipline, pride, and a sense of tradition in the beleaguered army. The doctrine that had vainly attempted to spur the peasants to sacrifice and struggle for the communist state was abandoned, and the call to fight for Mother Russia and the homeland was fostered. Political officers, holding posts of importance in the Red Army, were soon to find themselves displaced by officers of military talent and merit. It was a series of massive changes born of desperation following months of sweeping successes by the German Wehrmacht. As our early successes ground to a halt, we found ourselves burdened under increasing hardship in efforts to maintain mobility and to replace our losses. In contrast, the Soviet Union grew in strength. Its massive industrial capacity, much of it transported to the protection of the Urals, concentrated on weapons production on a gigantic scale. Food supplies and combat support equipment began arriving from the United States in huge quantities. Against this overwhelming superiority in men and material, the Lancers could not prevail. The Soviets adopted the tactics of the Wehrmacht, and those advantages that were inherent in our military system were put to effective use by the Red Army. In contrast, the leaders in Berlin sacrificed immense numbers of soldiers to the same hold-at-any-cost mentality that had almost brought the Soviet army to ruin in 1941. The tables had turned. Hitler obstinately refused to yield ground to enhance our strategic situation. Thus, the Russians, with newfound strength, were able to pierce the thinly held lines and encircle vast numbers of German forces. The leadership of armies by political appointees, which had proven to be a hindrance to the effectiveness of the Soviet army, was demonstrated on an ever-increasing scale in the Wehrmacht. In the face of adversity and military setback, Hitler's reliance on politically loyal officers to oversee unwise and at times absurd policies began to mirror that of the Stalinist army in the pre-war years. The individual soldiers of the Red Army evolved into fighters distinctly different from the soldiers we had first encountered. The mentality of the Russian soldier changed from one of apathy and indifference to that of a patriot. The idea of belonging to an elite army that was alone saving the world from fascism was instilled, and a sense of pride evolved that had long been absent from the ranks of the Soviet armed forces. The Russian soldier proved to be an extremely tough adversary who, when properly motivated, could endure the most adverse of conditions. The standard-issue uniform in summer consisted of a loose-fitting khaki-brown tunic and trousers of lightweight material. In winter, heavy woolen material of quilted design was used, which afforded excellent insulation against the cold climate. The heavy greatcoat was carried in all seasons, as it was used as a blanket and a uniform item, as the situation required. The Russian soldier was issued boots several sizes too large, so as to enable him to wear them stuffed with straw or paper during the brutal winter months. This served as efficient and practical protection from the debilitating freezing temperatures, which caused so many casualties within our own army. In the latter months of the war, the Red Army forces were often equipped with large felt boots that offered excellent insulation qualities. Unfortunately, our boots were issued to fit very well, and on the Crimean front, we considered ourselves fortunate that we experienced a much less severe winter than those divisions languishing on the northern fronts. The weapons carried by our adversaries were of simple but practical design. During the early months of the war, the infantry units encountered by our forces were armed with bolt-action rifles similar to our own carbines. As the war continued, we began developing new automatic weapons that would deliver a much higher rate of fire to be used primarily in close combat. This tactic was employed by the Soviet Army as well, and the short-barreled submachine gun fitted with the high-capacity drum magazine soon symbolized the Red Army soldier. The Soviet soldier was a master at foraging and fending for himself. As the war progressed and the Russian supply lines lengthened relative to the Wehrmacht's defeats and withdrawals, the Red Army supported itself largely from the land it occupied. Armed with the submachine gun that held a high-capacity magazine, clothed in a uniform that suited the environment, and living from a sparse diet of whatever was immediately available, the Russian soldier proved to be a most able adversary. The Wehrmacht marched into the expanses of the Soviet Union with maps and intelligence documents that proved to be deceptively inaccurate. On the German maps, it was not uncommon to attempt to follow routes through terrain features that did not exist. A well-marked land route shown as an improved major thoroughfare would actually be a primitive dirt track. It became common practice to use captured Red Army maps whenever possible. These maps, known for their accuracy, were reproduced by the regimental staffs for our use, often with place names in both German and Cyrillic lettering. The Wehrmacht and the Red Army remained locked in deadly combat for almost 4 years, during which time the differences between the two forces, so apparent at the outset, became less obvious as the war continued. The German soldier, too, learned to master the art of improvisation, and out of necessity lived largely from the land as the supply system slowly collapsed. Out of practicality and necessity, even the uniforms became more similar, as did the weapons and tactics. Eventually, the Lancers found themselves better able to identify with the enemy, with whom they were engaged in brutal, unforgiving combat, than with the polished and sophisticated army they had known long ago in Germany. We observed mass numbers of desertions from the Soviet Army early in the war, and many of these deserters volunteered to serve our forces for a variety of reasons. Known to the Lancers as Hiwis, these workers were former enemy personnel who were previously members of the Red Army before being captured or deserting to us. Many of them volunteered to serve with us to escape the horrible conditions of the prisoner of war camps, far to the rear beyond the jurisdiction of the frontline forces, where they had faced unimaginable deprivations. There existed a distinction between those Hiwis who came to us from the prisoner of war camps and those who had suffered starvation and forced labor under the regime of Stalin and had thus come to hate the Bolsheviks. The freedom-loving mountain people of the Caucasus, the wandering nomads of the steppes and the Crimean Tatars, had defended themselves and their way of life for centuries against the Russians. Religion played no minor role as well, as the Islamic Crimean Tatars fiercely defended their religious freedom. Included in the personal effects of General Lindemann were several letters written by Russian Hiwis to relatives, accompanied by official translations provided by the field post censor, as translated by Gefreiter Peter Teslik, Aliev Nambed, FPNR, 17433. Do not believe anyone who tells you anything else. For 20 years we were prisoners of the godless Soviets, and we have hungered and worked day and night. Now we wish to help the German army with all our strength and with our hearts. In this sense we perform our daily duties. God the Almighty will give us strength to help defeat and destroy the godless enemy. Allah help us. Satyrov Vetut, FPNR, 27076, Pi BTL, 132, 3 Kompu. From now on, things will be better for us than ever would have been possible under the Soviets. For us, Tatars, comes a new good era. In the future, we will work no longer for others, but for ourselves. Islamov Said, Nalil, FPNR, 29787B. Father, on the 4th of April I arrived in the Crimea. Here we have found good conditions. We live together with the German soldiers. We eat and drink together. Every week we bathe. The soldiers are very friendly to us, and it is never boring here. When the officers arrive, they are not so arrogant, but are friendly to us. The officers are also friendly to the soldiers, and the soldiers respect the officers. The soldiers are never tormented. Quite the opposite is true. The Bolsheviks always spoke of socialism, but when one makes a comparison, the socialism lies with the Germans, and the Bolsheviks have none. True socialism is found in the German army: comradeship, equality, respect for one another, justice, and friendship. These qualities will guarantee a final victory. A Tatar. I can tell you that on the 24th, partisans from the mountains attacked the villages of Taigan, Rayon, and Karabusar. Afterwards, 60 Germans and 50 volunteer Tatars came and fought until the next morning to drive the partisans from the area. The partisans stole cattle, sheep, and horses. Kurtamelov Vasim, FPNR, 16691. I live for the German army, and together we will destroy the Bolshevik enemy. I fight for the freedom of the Tatar people, and to free the Islamic religion from the yoke of Bolshevism. Every Friday we go to the mosque and pray. If I survive this war, I will become the village Mola. Sevanata, FPNR, 12963. Things are going well. Do not worry about us. We have now become accustomed to things here. My German comrades are good people. Their generosity is difficult to imagine after having lived under the Soviets. The officers also live here with us. Write a prayer for me and send it. Ablamit Mechit, FPNR, 00462, Recon Bat, 132. The mosque is again open, and everyone goes to pray. We live once again as we did in earlier times. Allah has again blessed us. A letter written by a wife in response to correspondence received from a Hiwi describes the suffering of the civilian population. Hello, my husband. Mafrem, I send my regards and wish you the best of health. Your son Roslak, your daughter Naria, sister Aisha, and niece Lamara send their regards as well. Mafrem, your brother has been released and now works in the village as a barber. Mafrem, you have asked what support we have received. We have received nothing from the mayor. We receive bread once a week. There is no money, and when we request assistance, the mayor refuses. It was not necessary for you to report for service. Please do not ask how we are doing, as words are nothing, and we are not doing well. You probably have enough, and for that you have left your family. For that you can live alone, for when you return, you will not find your wife and children. In our own company, we had Alex, a former Soviet soldier of Caucasian origin, who had been taken prisoner by one of our units during the fighting. He had never seen the confines of a prisoner of war camp, but had been employed caring for the horses and performing duties for the cooks. He remained a loyal and unshakable assistant for the support units to the very last days of the war. We also received many labourers from the prisoner of war camps who had volunteered for service. The army did as much as possible to improve the conditions for a number of prisoners who, due to lack of transport, could not be moved from the combat sector. Our own rations were shortened to feed these prisoners, and the mortality rate remained at 2% as long as they remained under our immediate jurisdiction, which is remarkable when taken into account that most prisoners were exhausted or wounded when captured. When the Russians successfully landed in Feodosia, the capture of one particular camp, holding 5,000 prisoners, appeared to be imminent. Rather than face liberation by their Soviet comrades, the prisoners requested permission to march to the German lines at Simferopol, and this movement was conducted without the necessity of employing guards to prevent escapes. It is likely that they were fully aware of the treatment they would receive at the hands of the Soviets for having surrendered to the German army. Numbers of former prisoners of war volunteered to fight in the rear areas against partisan units and proved to be effective in protecting sensitive communications and transportation routes. It was even reported that various bands of partisans and bandits would engage one another in open battle for control of certain political districts and geographical areas, thus establishing a distinction between those units that were organized and supplied directly by the Soviet government and those units that considered themselves independent from central control. There existed partisan bands on the Crimean Peninsula as well. Operating from strongholds deep within the Yaila Mountains, they recruited from the local population and the scattered remnants of Soviet army units. Such partisan units had been pre-planned and were well organized prior to the invasion, and deep within the mountains were large, well-established ammunition and supply caches. The partisan units consisted of a number of women, many of whom had lost their husbands, sons, and other family members in combat against our forces early in the war. The southern coastal road came under frequent attacks, at times making it necessary to provide a heavily armed escort for supply convoys in order to ensure safe passage. For the most part, the security units consisted of Romanian troops or volunteer Tarka and Cossack companies, as German forces were used to the last man on the front. Even the local inhabitants found themselves in constant danger from the partisans. As had become commonplace throughout the Eastern Front, the partisans fought with brutality and lawlessness, presenting a constant threat in every rear area. On the 20th of May 1942, we marched over the battlefield of the last 12 days toward the west. We passed the hotly contested Parpach position, the Moscow area, Hill 55.6, crossed over the tank trenches, and traversed the Anglo-Indian telegraph line. In some areas, the telegraph poles were splintered and broken, the cables draped in tangles from the stumps. The troops took advantage of the opportunity to gather copper cables to fill the countless needs of an army in the field. The telegraph line began in London, stretching through the North Sea, over the Crimea, across the Caucasus, and over Persia to Calcutta. Before falling victim to our war, it had linked 2 continents, and for decades had served the world, especially English colonial politics, with peaceful purposes. At the edge of a shallow valley, we left the thin, wiry grass of the steppes and entered lush green fields surrounding a small village with clean cottages. Most of the cottages were made of light-coloured stone with outer surrounding walls. The sweet smell of flowers met us here, and we soon discovered that this valley was the source for a trade in rose petals. Along the floor of the valley we found a sea of roses stretching to the horizon. The inhabitants came originally from Romania and settled here during the time of Empress Catherine of Russia. During the summer season they gather millions of rose petals for processing, and from 1,000 petals they receive 1 gram of rose oil. Under the control of Joseph Stalin, this industry, which had primarily served the upper classes from the time of the feudal barons, was exploited further to earn desperately needed revenue for the Soviet state. During our earlier attack on Kerch in this same area, we had captured a small Russian tracked vehicle that had been abandoned fully intact by its previous owners. Before advancing farther toward Kerch, we had removed the alternator as a simple means of reserving the vehicle for our own use. After poring over maps and scouring the area, we located the vehicle standing intact on the side of a gentle slope, just as we had left it. With the installation of the alternator and a few adjustments, it was ready for service, and we immediately put it to good use towing our puck. It was outfitted with the same type of Ford motor that was so commonplace among the captured vehicles, and despite a broken track link, it proved to be very reliable, providing us with months of uninterrupted service. Outfitted with our new equipment, complements of the Soviet Army, we marched onward toward our last objective in the Crimea, Sevastopol. A massive crescendo of fire erupted from the German lines. I adjusted the aim of the pack on the predetermined target. In early June 1942, the 132 Days Infantry Division was faced with its most demanding challenge of the war thus far. Since the recent winter battles, the enemy had been engaged in a concentrated effort to prepare and strengthen their defences, and had brought in fresh, newly equipped troops to reinforce the units that had suffered heavy casualties throughout their attempts to defend the Crimean Peninsula. The Soviets, strongly supported by supplies from the United States, also brought massive amounts of war materials into the assembly areas from the sea. It was imperative that the Sevastopol fortress, which was made up of a complex system of defences, be taken by the 11th Army. For the fortress to remain under Soviet control would serve to tie the German divisions to the Crimea at a time when they were badly needed elsewhere along the thinly held Eastern Front. The efforts to capture Sevastopol could not be abandoned. They had to be carried through to prevent its future use by the Soviets as a bridgehead, from where offensives could be launched deep into Ukraine. Once this penetration into Ukraine could be accomplished, the Soviets would then be able to penetrate the German right flank, possibly severing the lifeline of entire armies advancing farther to the east. The Russians had long held total control over the area with their Black Sea fleet. Thus, this danger loomed over the German army in the Crimea for as long as they held ground on the peninsula. Regular bombardments from large-caliber naval guns at a distance of 20 kilometers from the coast had become commonplace. Until July 1942, the naval strength of the Axis in this area consisted of only a small number of Italian patrol boats in the harbours along the Crimean coastline. The position of Fortress Sevastopol enabled it to control the entire area of the Cherson Peninsula. Armed with numerous modern coastal batteries of heavy caliber that could be trained to fire on the landward side, the fortress was protected by heavy terrain from that direction as well. In the north, the Belbek Valley provided a natural earthwork for the foremost defences. In the east, the heavy underbrush and thick woods served as a barrier to attacking infantry, broken intermittently by sharply cut valleys, gorges and ravines, often with steep, impenetrable sides that made large-scale troop movement impossible. The forces destined to launch the final battle for Russia's strongest and largest fortress faced commanding heights that offered a wide view for the defenders and presented the attackers with the immense task of penetrating deep valleys, steep ravines and thick underbrush. Particularly imposing was the line delineating the north front, running along the Belbek Valley, with the fortress Bastion I, the armoured battery Maxim Gorky, and the fortress Shishkova. The LIV Army Corps, under the able command of General der Kavallerie Hansen, was assigned to lead the first assault on the fortresses, with support from the 132nd, the 22nd, the 50th, and the 24th Infantry Divisions. Heavy batteries of calibers up to 800 mm were brought up and emplaced in preparation for the attack scheduled for June 7th. For 7 days prior to the attack, a barrage blanketed the heavily defended enemy positions, and the battery Maxim Gorky drew special attention from the German gunners. The 132nd Infantry Division, on the right wing of LIV Army Corps, was set into motion with the task of launching a frontal assault across the Belbek Valley, to take the Olberg under attack, and to push toward the southwest, placing themselves in position to storm the commanding heights of Bastion I and Maxim Gorky from the southeast. The neighbouring unit on the left, the 22nd Infantry Division, would be in position to launch an attack only after the successful capture of the heights of the Olberg. During the last days of May, the batteries of our artillery regiments were pulled into their new positions, which lay in the northern sectors. In the following days, the ravines and valleys resounded with the low thunder of countless artillery barrages, continually pounding the enemy positions in preparation for the attack to follow. The batteries fired day and night on assigned sectors. The 5th Battery attempted to establish an observation point on the Koberberg, from where the Soviet positions in the Belbek Valley could be observed. The ominous droning of aircraft from both antagonists filled the air during the hours of daylight as they sought their living targets, and dive bombers could be seen periodically descending on the city in the distance. The enemy anti-aircraft positions were successfully neutralized through the efforts of the dive bombers and artillery fire, though at a heavy cost to our Luftwaffe. Throughout the night, Fieseler-Storch reconnaissance aircraft circled over the Soviet lines, while the Russians attempted in vain to illuminate their locations with floodlights, which often swept the terrain at a level low enough to reveal any movement in our ground defences. The activities of these aircraft also served to conceal the noise of our own motorised columns as they advanced toward the line. We arrived at our position on the 5th of June, hastily digging into defences at a distance of only 100 metres from the foremost Russian outposts. Our captured Russian prime mover was used to bring the gun into position. As we approached our position, we passed a heavy 600 mm mortar with an extremely short barrel, and our investigation revealed a weapon that was new to us. The gun crew advised us that when the mortar was fired, the barrel would compress in a telescoping action to provide a recoilless effect, and we were told that the weapon was deployed to the Sevastopol front for specific use against Maxim Gorky. During its firing, it was possible to see the giant projectiles in flight, and the Lancers immediately dubbed them flying coffins. Our anti-tank gun was situated to the right of a steep cliff, concealed in a shallow depression opposite the emplacement Maxim Gorky. Throughout the previous night, we had hacked a shallow trench into the rocky earth, the hard ground giving way only to the heavy picks that were carried in our tracked vehicle. The nights were of short duration, which enabled us only 5 or 6 hours of darkness, during which we could work in relative safety before we would be visible to the enemy observers a short distance from our position. The assault preparations against the coastal fortress neared completion. It was known that the fortress consisted of hundreds of concrete and steel-reinforced embrasures, belts of bunkers, armoured batteries, deep trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. Situated deep within the cliffs were rocket launchers and mortar positions that could not be reached or neutralised by conventional artillery fire or airstrikes. The artillery, rockets, flak and assault guns pounded the enemy positions for 5 days prior to the attack. 1,300 guns opened fire on pre-designated targets and field positions. The squadrons of General von Richthofen's 8th Flieger Corps bombed the Russian defences mercilessly. The earth churned and was tortured in a murderous overture. Never before or never again during the war would the German forces mass such artillery, which more than equalled the 1,000 guns used by Montgomery against Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein. The Nebelwerfers were assigned a special role in the assault plans. The heavy 1st Werfer Regiment, the 70th Werfer Regiment, and the 1st and 4th Werfer sections were attached to a special staff commanded by Oberst Niemann in front of the fortress. 21 batteries opened fire with 576 guns, including the 1st Werfer Battery with its 28 centimeters and 32 centimeters high explosive and incendiary projectiles. With each barrage, 324 rocket projectiles were fired per second from the barrels of this regiment on predetermined targets. The barrages served to demoralize the enemy troops, as well as to physically destroy their defensive capabilities, achieving the same end effect. A battery of 6 launchers was capable of firing 26 flaming projectiles with nerve-wracking screams, creating a terrible effect on the recipients. The shrapnel from these projectiles was not as effective as the splintering of artillery shells, but the explosive effect upon detonation within a confined area or at close range would rupture blood vessels with a benumbing shock wave. The enemy soldiers located within the immediate vicinity of the impact area were rapidly demoralized by the ear-splitting blasts, and basic instinctive fear quickly gave way to terror and panic. The stoic Russian soldiers, usually insensitive even to the Stuka attacks, were often rendered stunned and helpless under these barrages. 3 exceptional artillery behemoths were sent into operation at Sevastopol: the Gamma mortar, the mortar Karl, also called Thor, and the giant railway gun Dora. All 3 were at the time considered wonder weapons of the conventional artillery forces, and had been designed and manufactured for the specific purpose of penetrating reinforced concrete bunkers and fortresses. The Gamma mortar was simply the Big Bertha cannon of World War I resurrected. The weapon fired 427 mm projectiles. The Gamma weapon, in all its immensity, was a dwarf compared to the 615 mm mortars Karl or Thor. Designed for the specific purpose of destroying concrete embrasures, the 2 200-kilogram projectiles were fired from a weapon that had little in common with conventional mortars. The 5M barrel and the giant carriage provided the impression of a wheeled factory sporting an immense chimney silhouetted at an angle against the sky. Yet Karl was not the perfected model of artillery produced by our technology. The largest gun was located in Bakhchisaray in the Palace of Gardens, the old residence of the Khan of the Tartars, and was officially christened Dora. The Lancers referred to it as Heavy Gustav, and with its 800 bore, it remained the heaviest cannon of the war. 60 railway cars were required for the transportation of the separate parts, which required assembly on location for the weapon to be rendered active. A high-explosive shell weighing 4,800 kilograms, or almost 5 tons, was fired from a barrel 32.5 meters in length. It was also capable of firing a 7,000-kilogram armor-piercing shell a distance of 38 kilometers. The projectile and casing had a total length of 7.8 meters. If placed vertically, the ammunition would stand as tall as a 2-story house. The maximum rate of fire was 3 rounds in an hour. 2 flak units were assigned as permanent security. The service crew, additional security, and maintenance personnel for this monster consisted of a major general, a colonel, and 1,500 men. This obsolete military philosophy relies on conventional artillery pieces in a perverse giant form that had so increased in dimensions that they became counter-effective in terms of men and material required for support and use. Nevertheless, a single shot from Dora was reported to have penetrated 30 meters of earth to destroy a massive underground ammunition depot at Severnaya Bay near Sevastopol. Deep in positions well situated and protected by natural terrain, the Soviets labored on their defenses while they waited for the attackers. The fortress was defended by 7 Soviet rifle divisions, a dismounted cavalry division, 2 rifle brigades, 3 navy brigades, 2 naval infantry regiments, and various armoured battalions with independent units, totalling over 100,000 men. 10 artillery regiments and 2 mortar battalions, an anti-tank regiment, as well as 45 heavy gun units of coastal artillery stood with a total of 600 guns and 2,000 mortars in the defensive line. These forces made up the enormous defence, all of which had to be overrun and captured or destroyed by the 11th Army, with a force totalling only 7 weakened German divisions and 2 ill-equipped Romanian divisions. We assembled at the headquarters of the 2 Battalion, 436th Regiment, on the evening of the 6th of June, where we were briefed that the attack would be launched the following morning at 0305. My gun crew was assigned to take a Soviet emplacement under fire that was situated half left from our position and slightly higher in elevation. The target was clearly visible at a distance of 300 meters from our position. We spent the night crouching under our shelter quarters in the narrow trenches dug behind our gun. In the early morning hours, while still cloaked in darkness, we shook ourselves free from the cover and warmth of our hastily improvised shelters, and in the crisp night air prepared to launch our barrage at precisely 0305. At exactly the prescribed time, a massive crescendo of fire erupted from the German lines. As the sky in the east was showing the first hint of dawn, I adjusted the aim of the puck on the predetermined target and opened fire, shot after shot, alternating armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Within minutes, I observed a red flare floating toward the earth through the smoke and darkness to our left, a signal to us from our own forces indicating that the assault elements were moving forward. I adjusted the fire accordingly, so as not to engage our own units storming toward the enemy positions. Despite the coming of daylight, the visibility continued to worsen, with steam, smoke, and clouds of dust covering the target positions. An angry enemy had now been awakened, and we found ourselves taken under direct fire from the battery Maxim Gorky. Shell bursts of all calibers began to explode around us, including naval gunfire from the warships. Helpless to react, we could only cower in our shallow trenches, pray for survival, and wait out the storm. Countless impacts surrounded us and seemed to engulf our gun. Shrapnel filled the air, hissing and whistling overhead. We were showered with hunks of stone and earth as massive shells exploded nearby, tossing brown-black geysers skyward and leaving us numb with fear. The earth trembled, dust filled our eyes, and it became difficult to breathe. We lay motionless, pressed against the earth in our trenches, as rocks and dirt rained on dull grey-green helmets. Our hands were clapped tightly over our ears, and we squeezed our eyes shut in vain attempts to block out the unexpected horror that had descended on us. A member of my gun crew, who had bravely served through all our previous engagements, suddenly scrambled to a far corner of our trench, pulled his helmet from his head, and screamed over the roar of explosions, "I can't take it any more!" Foaming at the mouth and his eyes wide with terror, he struggled to his feet in an attempt to spring from the trench. I threw myself on him and wrestled him to the ground as another shell exploded near the edge of the earthwork, sending white-hot splinters whistling through the air. Grinding his teeth, clawing and struggling wildly, he fought to escape. Rising quickly, I struck him hard across the face and threw myself on him once more. He lay motionless, staring wide-eyed at me, and I released him to seek shelter beneath the edge of the trench. He suddenly sprang forward as if possessed, and in one motion cleared the berm, sprinting bareheaded through the clouds of smoke and dust and disappearing toward the rear. We again dove for cover as the hail of shells increased, and we never expected to see him alive again as we pressed ourselves against the earth in an attempt to escape the explosions and shell fragments. Later that evening, after the guns had fallen silent, he reappeared at our position as if nothing had occurred, and the incident was never mentioned. The 5th Company, Infantry Regiment 437, broke through the enemy trench system at the point of the cliff that lies on the northern side of the Belbek Valley. Reinforced by the enemy to serve as a secure strongpoint, the deep ravines of the valley provided the enemy protection from our artillery fire. Fritz, a friend I had known since our recruit training in Darmstadt, lay with his group in an assembly position before the cliff. He pulled a hand grenade from his belt, jerked the priming cord, and tossed it over his head into the enemy trench before him. At that instant, a Russian infantryman opened fire with a burst from a submachine gun, and an explosive bullet tore into Fritz's arm, rendering him unconscious with shock. The accompanying Lancers stormed forward through the smoke and dust. Regaining his senses, Fritz crawled along the earth to the rear to report the breach in the defences. His grenade had killed the enemy gunner, which enabled a small opening in the Soviet defences to be exploited by Lancers in grey-green, who continued to push forward rapidly, penetrating the enemy positions. The successes in our sector resulted in several hundred metres of ground won, while farther to our left, our infantry company was able to overrun the forward defences of the Belbek Valley. On the During this period, Infantry Regiment 213 was assigned to reinforce the division and was placed into action on the right wing. The Russians made numerous unsuccessful attempts to break through the lines on this wing in an effort to regain the Ohlberg. A massive attack was scheduled for the 17th of June. New fire objectives were relayed to the artillery batteries, and shells bursting on isolated nests of enemy resistance could be observed from the front. At 0745, we received word that the GPU battlement had fallen to our infantry. At 0830, it was reported that the battlements Siberia and Volga had also been taken by German troops. Following an hour of fierce fighting, our infantry breached the line of defence that had been established among primitive dwellings near Bastion 1, and at 0845, the bastion was taken by the assault troops. At 1000, the enemy batteries, firing from positions near Bartenyevka, were silenced as well. At 1200, our foremost assault elements continued to hold Bastion against heavy enemy counterattacks. Between 1250 and 1315, each battery from our artillery regiment fired 80 rounds on Shishkova. Still, the positions remained resolutely defended by the Soviet infantrymen, who refused to yield a metre of ground. The Lancers attempting to hold the bastion became engaged in hand-to-hand fighting during the desperate Soviet counterattacks, and the battle swept back and forth as the positions were captured, overrun, and recaptured. The positions were littered with dead and dying. The walking wounded staggered and careened senselessly through the smoke that engulfed the defences. The units of both antagonists became mixed inseparably as the soldiers shot, clubbed, and bayoneted one another. At 14:45, the position Molotov was reported to have fallen to our forces. Heavy Artillery Battalion 641 had been assigned to destroy the Maxim Gorky I stronghold with two 355 mm mortars that were located 4 kilometres to the west of the Olberg. These massive projectiles, weighing 1,000 kilograms each, were delivered to the breech of the gun with cranes. The mortars had previously seen action during the French campaign against the defences of Luettich. The projectiles were designed not to explode on impact, but were set with delayed fuses designed to detonate after the protecting concrete layers of the fortress had been penetrated. Shortly after the first rounds left the barrels of these monstrous guns, the report arrived from the observers that the fortress cupola had flown from its mounting. Maxim Gorky has been penetrated. The 305 mm shells stored within the massive Russian battery began to explode, with huge fragments ricocheting wildly in the air. At last, the battery fell silent beneath a cloud of dust and smoke. The pioneer and infantry units assaulted the hill. Within the concrete colossus, which measured 300 metres long and 40 metres wide, the occupants continued to resist stubbornly. When the fall of the emplacement appeared inevitable, some of the defenders made a desperate attempt to break out in isolated groups.